much. Well, good morning. What a wonderful morning it is. Welcome to the fifth week of our sermon series on walking in the Spirit, and this is our third and our final week on cultivating the fruit of the Spirit. So my name is Archie. I'm the community outreach worker here at PBC. So I work with Glenn and Belle on the staff team. And an interesting fact, an interesting-ish fact about me and Glenn is not just that Glenn serves me with bringing me stuff like this when he can, which is very nice, but is that Glenn has never seen me driving whilst someone has cut me off at a roundabout. And the reason why I know that is because Glenn has asked me to speak about faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And nothing screams gentleness and self-control, right? Like a good bit of road rage with Hillsong worship bopping in the background. I really wish that I could make this a really super short sermon by borrowing a trick from the Apostle Paul's book. Paul appeals to the Corinthians 2 times that they should imitate him as he imitates Christ. The thing is that if you imitate me as I imitate Paul, as he imitates Christ, then you're not going to end up being all that faithful or gentle or self-controlled. So that's one of the reasons why I've actually struggled to prepare for this sermon. It's not just that I'm deficient in faithfulness and gentleness and self-control, but it's also that I really have no great ideas about how to get there. So that's my first problem, it's me. My second problem this morning is you. Specifically, the fact that I don't know every single thing that happens in your life. I mean, I have a rough idea that Lewis is better than me at fantasy football and stuff like that, but I'm not an expert in your daily routines, your relational dynamics, or your natural tendencies. And you might be sat there thinking, well, good. That means that you're not a stalker. That's not a problem at all. And it's true. I'm not stalking you. The only person I stalk is our cat, Angus. And the fact that I just referred to him as a person is definitely an issue. But it makes it hard to preach this sermon about the fruit of the Spirit because each of these fruits is intensely situational, and what is gentle for one person is not gentle for another. What is faithful in one instance is not faithful in another. And what is self-controlled behavior for some leads to self-hatred and self-destruction for others. We have to be careful how we talk about these fruits, and each of them works themselves out in a myriad of different ways, depending on our settings and our circumstances. And so I can't give you a 10-point plan on how to become better at each of these fruits. I apologize if that's what you came here hoping for. Sorry, it's going to be a few minutes of just disappointment for you. But that's fine. We'll worship at the end. The thing about the 10-point plans is that it kind of defeats the point of walking in the Spirit. I mean, we can ourselves create and maintain a hospitable environment for the Spirit to work in our lives, but ultimately, as Glenn has said before, as Belle has said before, as anyone who's preached in this sermon series has said before, these are the fruit of the Spirit of God, and they are not the blood, sweat, and tears of the striving of Nick or Karen or you or me. So what I do think that I can do, though, instead of a 10-point plan this morning, is present us with some models of faithfulness, some models of gentleness and of self-control. And I hope that these models will spark our own imaginations to think, okay, so this is how I can be faithful in my life. And right, okay, so that is how I can be gentle in this situation. I've got 2 simple questions for each fruit. Is God faithful, gentle, self-controlled? And can God's people be faithful, gentle, self-controlled? And an interesting thing that we'll discover along the way is that it's actually really hard to be absolute about this. It's not a straightforward thing to say, well, this person exemplifies this fruit perfectly, because some of our best models of the fruit of the Spirit turn out to be utterly horrific examples in other instances. And this is quite a famous example, but King David. He's a man apparently after God's own heart, and he's one of the Old Testament's most celebrated heroes, and yet he was not faithful to his soldiers when he sent them out into warring season, but stayed behind himself to enjoy the luxury of his palace. And from the luxury of his palace, He did not show very much self-control when he saw Bathsheba bathing and sent for her. And what happened next? The royal abuse of power to sleep with Bathsheba, then assassinate her husband on the battlefield, we can probably all agree was not very gentle. And yet, David is going to crop up later in this sermon as a model for good self-control. Humans are complicated. I think that this is encouraging. I think it's encouraging because it shows us that discipleship, walking in the Spirit, is not some straight line of continual development, continual improvement upwards. It's a squiggling smudge of crayon that dips and loops its way into an abstract but intelligible portrait of Jesus at the center of our lives. And so without any further ado, faithfulness. Faithfulness is about being trustworthy and dependable. And being trustworthy and dependable over a prolonged period of time. Faithfulness is, to borrow Eugene Peterson's phrase, a long obedience in the same direction. And in the case of God, because God is not obedient to us, we can say that faithfulness is a long commitment in the same direction. But that does beg the question, is God faithful? The answer, which you might have shouted out, and which I would like to suggest this morning, is an absolutely resounding yes. That probably won't surprise you. The saying that God is faithful is graffitied generously throughout the entire Bible, and one such instance of this is Lamentations chapter 3, where the poet writes, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is God's faithfulness." What is remarkable about this is that the poet pens these words with the backdrop of the Babylonians destroying Jerusalem and exiling God's people. How could the poet still think that God is faithful when Israel has been annihilated and enslaved? Well, one answer to this question is that this poem is an expression of hope. God is faithful, so he will at some point redeem us. He's done it before, he'll do it again. And we'll get to that. But a second answer, I think, is that Israel's destruction at the hands of Babylon was itself proof that God was faithful. What God promised to the Israelites comes to pass. Israel had been called by God to be his people, who would be blessed and who would use that blessing to share with the rest of creation. Now, the problem was that the blessing was barely being shared around Israel. The Israelites were continually missing the mark. They were worshipping other gods. They served only their own interests. And instead of addressing injustice, they oppressed the poor even more. That's not good behavior, really, from God's people. And so God warned them repeatedly that sin has consequences. And one such consequence of sin was that God would deal with Israel's evil by allowing an even greater evil to swamp it, Babylon. And this is what happens. Babylon invades Israel and takes them all back to Babylon with them. God was faithful to his words of judgment. But because talking about judgment isn't always the most pleasant thing in the world, some good news is that mercy triumphs over judgment. The poet can write of God's mercy being new every morning because the poet knows that God is faithful. God has saved his people before, and God will save his people again. The entire story of Scripture is that of God's faithfulness to his people. And if you don't believe me, read it. You can do it now if you want, but I mean, that's a bit rude. We were doing Exodus with the youth a few weeks back. You can look, if you're going to read the Bible during my sermon, go ahead, because there could be worse things that you'd be reading during the sermon. So that's fine. We were doing Exodus with the youth a few weeks back, and in Exodus alone, you are completely blown away by how faithful God is to his people. God hears their prayers, he sees their suffering, he defeats the Pharaoh, he sets them free into the wilderness, and he continues a long commitment to guiding them and sustaining them in the same direction of the promised land. even with their disobedience, even with their backseat driving, even with their droning on and on about whether they were nearly there yet. God is faithful to his people. And his faithfulness to his people even extends into his putting on flesh and dwelling amongst us. Jesus, the Messiah, the Lion of Judah. So God is faithful. I think we can be agreed. But can God's people be faithful? Now, I've picked some examples of faithfulness, of gentleness, of self-control, and I've tried to find some surprising ones, some potentially subversive ones, because I just thought that would be interesting. So bear with me and hopefully enjoy the ride. In Genesis chapter 38, a prostitute sits by the wayside on the road to Timnah. Judah, one of the sons of Jacob, leader of one of Israel's 12 tribes, has finished the period of mourning for his wife's death. He's now taking his sheep to their appointment with the shearers. Judah's sheep shearers, by the way, are located in Timnah. Now I ask you, what do you do in ancient Israel whilst you're waiting for your sheep to become shorn? Well, if you're Judah in Genesis 38, what you do is you find that woman by the roadside and you get to know her in a very biblical Hebrew sense of the word, which is essentially a euphemism to say that you sleep with her. So Judah's busy getting to know this woman, but what Judah didn't know is that this woman was not a prostitute. She wasn't a prostitute at all. She was his daughter-in-law, Tamar. And Tamar has now received from Judah a baby. Well, in the future it will be a baby. And she's also received Judah's ring, Judah's cord, and Judah's staff. Now, Judah thinks that the ring, the cord, and staff were exchanged for Tamar's services. But what Tamar knows is that she's going to use this ring, this cord, and this staff to prove the identity of the baby when it's born, and to trick Judah, and to prove to him that the baby was his, that he was not faithful to her, and that she has actually done right. It's a typically messy Israelite story. So why are we talking about it? We're talking about Tamar because I would like to suggest that she's a fantastic example of tenacious, audacious faithfulness. Judah, I think, would agree with me. At the end of the story, he declares that Tamar is far more right than he was. And to be honest, there's not really saying that much because Judah doesn't come off very well in the story. But how is Judah faithful? Well, Judah's not faithful. That's not what I meant to ask. What I meant to ask is, how is Tamar faithful? And to answer this question, we need to acknowledge some uncomfortable truths about the time before the time that we live in. And one of those uncomfortable truths is that family lines, heritage, ancestry were very, very important. One of life's greatest joys, in fact, was when a family's next generation was produced. And because women have wombs, they play quite an important role in that production. Childbearing was one of the most highly valued purposes for women at that time. Now, unfortunately for Judah and for Tamar, the next generation in the line of Judah was still pending. The child creating was buffering, if you like. Tamar had married Judah's first son, a man called and was a wicked man, and died before delivering the goods. Now, thankfully, ancient Israel had a law for such a time as this, and it was called Levirate marriage. And it catered for occasions of a childless first marriage by allowing a man's brother to marry the widow and do the deed of baby-making on the brother's behalf. This is probably also an uncomfortable thing to acknowledge for us. What this meant for Tamar was that she was married to Judah's second son, called Onan. Now, Onan thought, oh no, because any offspring from this union would not technically be his, but would be his brother's. And so Onan refused to reply. This was evil, and he died. Now, Judah has now lost 2 of his sons by now, and he grows concerned that his third son might die as well if he marries Tamar, because, well, obviously Tamar is the problem and not the fact that his sons are evil. I mean, that would, it's obvious. So Judah promises his third son to Tamar, but he never actually intends to be faithful to his word, and he sends Tamar back to her family where she came from because, it's better to send her away as a disgraced widow than to ever actually care for her, right? And so this leads to the roadside trick that Tamar plays. And the whole story ends 891 chapters later in Matthew chapter 1, verse 3. Tamar is named as the mother of Judah's heir, making her one of only 5 women to be included in Jesus' genealogy. Tamar is faithful to the line of Judah. Without Tamar, Judah's family would have ended, and there would have been no Jesus. There would have been no Lion of Judah. Tamar is not faithful in a conventional sense, and I would like to be very clear about that this morning. I'm not at all in any way recommending that we go out and trick our fathers-in-law. So sorry if that's what you wanted to get from this message. But Tamar is faithful because she is unwavering in her endeavor to give life to her community. And Tamar is faithful because she is innovative. That's a hard way to say. Innovative. Tamar is innovative. I'm not going to say it again. You know what I mean. Innovative. In her attempts to bring blessing out of adversity. There we go. She gives life to her community. She brings blessing out of adversity. And in these regards, I think that we can be faithful as well. So what about gentleness? Is God gentle? Can God's people be gentle? Or what does it even mean to be gentle? The theologian Christopher Wright is probably right when he says that gentleness is the ability to endure things without aggression. And so, if your cat wakes you up at 3 a.m. banging on the wardrobe doors because he wants to get in, a gentle person in that situation would endure that without aggression. And I will not comment on whether or not that's true for me. But I do think that this understanding of gentleness as enduring things without aggression, I think this is only half of the story. This fruit of gentleness can sometimes be translated as humility. And I think that this brings us closer to an idea of gentleness that goes beyond flowers and daisies and cuteness and stuff like that. Although flowers and daisies and cuteness can be nice, gentleness is a humble disposition. Gentle people adopt a humble attitude that recognizes other people as people, that believes that as people they matter, and that treats them with the corresponding dignity and respect. Gentleness isn't people-pleasing. A gentle person can stand their ground. A gentle person can be strong. But because they are humans loved by God and made in his image, they do not use their strength to bully other people or abuse them, because they know that they're also humans loved by God and made in his image. A gentle person will use their strength to lift others up, to treat them with respect. And so can God be gentle? God is, I'd have to say, and maybe you could agree with me, pretty strong. I've never arm wrestled him, I wouldn't want to, but out of everything that has existed ever, you'd probably definitely have to say that God has the most grounds to be superior. He is. God is the best. And yet when we read the story and the stories of Scripture, we see time and time again that God does not lord his power over us. God is gentle towards us. One example is that when Abraham and Sarah lose their faith in God's promise that they're going to have descendants as numerous as the stars, Sarah and Abraham agree to a plan where Abraham will get to know one of his slave girls, Hagar. And I'd point out that it's unlikely that Hagar agreed to this scheme, but Hagar does conceive, and Sarah is fuming. She's fuming. It's exactly what she'd planned, but Sarah does not endure this turn of events gently without aggression. Sarah abuses her power, and she deals with Hagar so harshly, in fact, that Hagar runs away. This actually happens 2 times. In an extremely stark contrast to Sarah and Abraham, God is gentle. That probably doesn't surprise us. An angel of the Lord finds Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness, and he comforts her. God restores Hagar, he encourages Hagar, and he shares with Hagar and her son Ishmael his blessing. The name that Hagar gives to God in this instance, the God who sees. God sees us, God cares, and God uses his strength to lift us up and not put people down. That's what gentleness is about. Can God's people be gentle? Well, let's start by acknowledging that Jesus had two disciples who were nicknamed the Sons of Thunder. It's not a particularly promising start. And it actually gets worse, because when Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter, he pulls out his sword and he chops off someone's ear. And this is exactly how you pull out your sword and chop off someone's ear. Thank you. I've been working on that. I didn't, but my dad did, so it's probably passed down. Yeah. Peter pulls out his sword, chops off someone's ear, and that is not what a gentle person would do. The good news for that person is that Jesus was gentle where Peter wasn't, and he heals the guy's ear with this kind of super miracle ear glue. And the good news for us is that Jesus' disciples have set a pretty low bar when it comes to gentleness. And even if we look at Paul, we see that in the very same letter where he recommends that we be gentle and bear gentleness as a fruit of the Spirit, Paul himself slams the Galatians as foolish and then declares his desire that the false teachers in their midst would castrate themselves. If we imitate Paul as he imitates Christ, we're not going to be very gentle, and we're going to end up in some very uncomfortable situations. Paul can be a prickly character. And perhaps he's not the definitive example of gentleness, but if we look at the life of Paul, we actually see through the actions of other people in it what it can mean to be gentle. In particular, this morning, I'd like to highlight Ananias. Ananias is a disciple of Jesus who lived in Damascus. At that time, disciples of Jesus were being hunted down, imprisoned, and even killed. And one of their fiercest persecutors was a man called Paul. He was called Saul when he was a Christian hunter, but because it could be confusing if I talk about Paul and Saul, and I keep calling him Paul. I hope that's all right. If it's not, write me an email. Ananias sees a vision where he's told to go to a certain street, and on that certain street, find the house where Christian catching Paul is staying. Once Ananias has found Paul, he's then to lay his hands on Paul and restore Paul's sight to him. We should maybe add at this point that Paul is blind, not because he was born blind, but because on the way to Damascus to hunt up some Christians, he saw a bright, blinding light, and Jesus spoke to him through that light, and the light blinded him. Paul becomes a Christian, but no one in Damascus really knows that yet. We can understand why Ananias might be hesitant to do what God has asked him to do. He wonders with God whether this is in fact God's best idea, seeing as Paul has done so much evil to the followers of Jerusalem, Jesus in Jerusalem, and Paul's got powers to go around arresting Christians wherever he sees them. But God informs Ananias, it's all right, it's okay, don't worry about it. I've shown Paul a vision of you healing him, and by the way, I'm also going to use Paul to spread the gospel to the whole world. So Ananias, he shows extraordinary faithfulness to God and gentleness to Paul. He goes to the street, he finds the house, he gets to Paul, and here is Paul, the tormentor of the faith, but now weak, blind, and disorientated. Ananias could do many things in this situation, and yet he greets Paul as brother, heals his blindness, and then presumably plays a part in the baptizing of Paul and the caring of Paul and restoring to health that happens later with the rest of the believers in Damascus. Ananias does not repay Paul's evil with further evil. Ananias treats Paul with dignity and welcomes him warmly, but not naively, into the family of believers. And that is, I think, what gentleness is about. enduring things without aggression, possessing a humble outlook towards others that we use to bless and not curse. And so finally, self-control. It's common, I think, for preachers to limit self-control to the realm of the sexual. I wonder if it's easy for them to get a response from that because, anyway, this I think is a mistake. When we talk about self-control, we're talking about way more than whether we controlled our lust for the hottie with a body we saw on the beach the other day. I mean, self-control is about sex, and it matters that we're controlled. But it's not all about sex, and I think it's dangerous to think of it in that way. Self-control is the opposite of self-indulgence. What this means is that as much as we're not to commit adultery, we're also to keep a safe and a healthy rein on things such as our temper, our time, our appetite, our ambitions, and our tongues. God cares just as much about who we slander as who we sleep with. In that sense, self-control, I think, has a somewhat negative function in that it's kind of about us stopping ourselves from doing bad things. But I also think that self-control can be a positive practice. We are self-controlled when we are deliberate about doing good things. So is God self-controlled? Well, is God self-controlled? I'd have to say, I think, yes. God is not a freewheeling splurge of wild omnipotence. God is not an untamed explosion of ecstatic divinity. From the beginning, we see God bringing order out of chaos. God speaks, creation assembles. God knows what he's doing, and he does it incredibly deliberately. We can also consider that Jesus was tempted in every way that we are, and yet did not sin. As Son of God levels of self-control exemplified by the Son of Man. Humans, by contrast, and we know this from experience, do not have supreme self-control. In fact, we suck at self-control. We're rubbish at it. This has been evident ever since Eden. Even our good guys have got their uncontrolled days. The prophet of Elisha, for example, Elisha was the successor to the prophet Elijah. Now, Elijah was also a good guy and probably also lacked self-control in some instances, but I'd like to focus on Elisha. It's a shame that their names are so similar, isn't it? Because also I forgot to clean my glasses and there's a smudge which makes it hard to read my notes. Here we go. Start that point again. Take the prophet Elisha, for example. Elisha was the successor to Elijah, and he was a prophet in Israel. Elisha was an all-round great guy, and he performed a number of miracles, and one of these miracles, in 2 Kings chapter 4, he raises a dead child back to life. That is cool. That is amazing. Unfortunately, for Elisha, he was bald. As someone with a family history of baldness, and as someone who asks my hairdresser whenever I go whether my hairline is okay or not, I know that baldness is not a bad thing in and of itself. In fact, baldness is something to be celebrated. If you don't laugh about it, you cry, I think. The unfortunate thing about Elisha's baldness is not that he was bald, but it's that he was walking about one day and some youths start teasing him about his baldness. In a flash, Elisha turns around, curses the youths, and 2 bears run out of the woods and maul the kids. Miracle worker, sure. Self-controlled when it comes to touchy hairline subjects, not so much. Because there are so many examples of poor self-control in human history, I think it makes it worth celebrating the good times. We've already mentioned that David was not the holiest of men, but before he was king, he spent years on the run from the then king Saul. Saul wanted to kill David because David had been anointed as the king, and David was going to succeed Saul as king. Saul, as the king, wasn't happy that there was going to be another king. So Saul is chasing David, and one time when Saul was chasing David, he had fueled up with a big morning coffee to keep his energy levels high for the hunt, and all of a sudden, the coffee's laxative effects kick in. Saul needs the toilet, and he needs one now. There wasn't a litter tray kicking about, there wasn't a portaloo, so Saul dives into a cave to relieve himself. Unbeknownst to Saul, the cave that he'd chosen as his toilet was the cave that David had chosen to hide in. So here for David was the perfect opportunity. If he kills Saul, he can be free from the hunt and also become the king. What's he going to do? Well, if you know the story, you know that David doesn't kill Saul. He just chops off a corner of his robe thing and is very self-controlled. You might argue that David doesn't kill Saul because he knew that it would be a rather awkward story to tell at his coronation. Like oh, David, you're king. How did you become king? Oh, I just hid in the old guy's toilet and took care of my business whilst he was taking care of his. It's not the ascension to the throne story that little shepherd boys grow up dreaming of. But I would suggest that David shows some pretty excellent self-control here. And here is another example of an outcast showing self-control. It's in Luke chapter 17, and Jesus walks past 10 lepers. As Jesus walks past 10 lepers, they call out, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." So Jesus tells them to go and show themselves to the priests, and as they do, they're healed and made clean. Hallelujah. That's amazing. This is a cause for celebration, right? And also a cause for praise and thanksgiving. However, out of the 10 lepers who were healed, just one of them returns to Jesus to praise him, to thank him, to acknowledge this miracle of mercy. We can learn a lot from this story, but this morning maybe we can be inspired by the self-control that the healed leper displays and leaving the other 9 to go and do what he knows is right. David shows self-control and not doing the things that he knows that he shouldn't do. The healed leper shows that self-control means doing the things that we know that we should do. And so, to conclude, and a band, if you'd like to come up, you can, I guess. I don't know what's planned next in the service. You don't have to. To conclude, what do you think? Faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, are they possible in our lives? I'd like to suggest that absolutely they are. I hope that you'd agree. They're possible in our lives because we follow a God who has these fruits in abundance. The more time that we spend with this God, the more that we admire God's ways and attempt to adopt them ourselves, the more of this fruit that we'll bear. We've seen that it's possible for God's people to show these fruits. And we can also take consolation from the fact that we're not going to show them every time. We fail sometimes. Even me, even you, even Glenn. But the good news for us is that we worship a God who is self-controlled. He does not fly off the handle in anger every time we mess up. We worship a God who's gentle, who deals with us firmly but tenderly when we take a wrong step or when life doesn't go our way. And we worship a God who is faithful. We worship a God who does not stop loving us, does not stop caring for us, and will never, ever, ever give up on us. God's mercies are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. Amen.